My father was not an emotional man. At least, that's what I believed for 31 years. He was an engineer, practical, precise. He fixed things instead of talking about them. When my mother passed when I was 19, he didn't cry in front of me. Not once. He just quietly took over the cooking, learned to braid my little sister's hair from a YouTube video, and never mentioned his own grief again. Growing up, I mistook his silence for coldness. I spent years being frustrated with him, wishing he'd say, "I love you," the way other dads did in movies, wishing he'd ask how I was really doing, instead of just asking if my car was running okay. We had a relationship built on logistics, car maintenance, home repairs, the occasional awkward phone call that lasted 4 minutes and ended with, "All right, take care." I didn't know, back then, that he was writing to me the entire time. Just not with words. He was writing to me through the 1,000 small, wordless things he did. I just didn't have the language to read it yet. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4, at 63 years old, the doctors gave him 4 to 6 months. He lived for 5. And somewhere in those 5 months, between hospital visits and hospice care, and all the unbearable logistics of watching someone disappear slowly, he sat down. This man who never wrote so much as a birthday card longer than 1 line. And he wrote me 11 pages. I want to back up.
Because I think this part matters more than people realize. 3 weeks before he died, I visited him. He was thin by then, tired in a way that made him look smaller than I remembered. But his mind was sharp. We watched an Aid football game rerun together, the kind of thing we always did instead of talking about anything real. At one point, during a commercial break, he turned to me and said, out of nowhere, "You work too much, you know?" I laughed it off, told him I was building something, that it would pay off, that I just needed a few more years of grinding before I could slow down. He nodded slowly and said, "Everyone thinks they've got a few more years." I didn't understand the weight of that sentence at the time. I thought it was just something dying people say. A little melancholy, a little poetic. Nothing I needed to actually absorb. I left that visit feeling fine. Normal. I told myself I'd come back in 2 weeks, once I cleared this one deadline at work. He died 12 days later. I made it back in time, but only barely. The last 24 hours, mostly in silence, mostly holding his hand while machines beeped around us. I keep thinking about that commercial break, about how close I came to not really hearing him, about how many of us are one deadline away from missing the sentence that mattered most. The envelope said, in his neat engineer's handwriting,
"For my son, read this when you're ready, not before." I sat at my kitchen table at 11 at night, alone, and opened it. The first line nearly broke me before I'd even gotten through the whole page. He wrote that he'd never been good at saying things out loud, that he knew I'd spent years thinking he didn't feel things deeply, and that he was sorry for how much that must have hurt, but that everything he never said, he'd been trying to show me instead. In every meal he cooked, in every ride he gave, and every late night he stayed up helping me with homework he barely understood. He explained, plainly, that he was proud of me. Not because of anything I'd accomplished, he was very specific about that, but because of who I'd become underneath the accomplishments. Then the letter shifted. It stopped being about me, and it became something else entirely. A dying man's honest account of what he wished he'd understood earlier about how to actually live. I read it once through in silence. Then I read it again, slower, with a pen, because I realized I needed to actually study it, not just grieve. The first real lesson in that letter was about work. He wrote that he'd spent 35 years at the same company, working late nights, missing dinners, telling himself every single year that this year was the year he'd finally slow down and be more present. And every year there was a new project, a new deadline, a new reason to push it one more year. He wrote something I've never forgotten.
Work will never volunteer to let you go. You have to take yourself back from it. He told me he regretted, more than almost anything, the number of Saturdays he spent finishing reports instead of teaching me to fish or fix a bike, or just sitting on the porch doing nothing at all.
Reading that, sitting in my own apartment at midnight, with 3 unanswered work emails glowing on my phone, I felt something crack open in my chest. I was doing exactly what he described. I had convinced myself that grinding now was temporary, a phase, a sacrifice for some future version of rest that always stayed exactly 1 year ahead of me, no matter how many years passed. He wasn't telling me to quit my job or stop being ambitious. He was telling me that ambition without boundaries doesn't feel like ambition from the inside. It feels like missing your whole life while telling yourself you're building one. The second lesson explained something I'd spent 31 years misunderstanding. He wrote about growing up in a house where his own father never once said, "I love you," where affection was shown through providing, through showing up, through fixing what was broken, never through words. He said he knew, intellectually, that I needed to hear things out loud, but some old inherited part of him simply couldn't produce the words, no matter how much he meant them. He wrote, "I know now that my silence cost you something. I want you to know it was never absence of feeling. It was absence of language. Please don't inherit my silence. Learn the words I never learned and say them to your own children before it's too late to matter." That sentence undid me completely, because I recognized myself in it immediately. I'd already started becoming quiet in the same.
Swallowing, "I'm proud of you," and "I love you" around my own friends. And eventually, I knew, around any children I'd have one day, because that's the only model I'd ever been given. He was handing me, in his last months, the exact awareness it had taken him 63 years and a terminal diagnosis to reach. He was trying to save me 30 years of the same mistake. The third section of the letter was the hardest to read because it was the most specific. He listed things, actual things. A trip to see the Northern Lights he and my mother had talked about for 15 years and never booked because there was always a more responsible use of the money. A friendship from college he let fade because reaching out felt awkward after so many years of silence. An apology he owed his own brother that he never delivered because pride kept getting in the way. And then his brother passed unexpectedly, and the apology became permanently, irreversibly too late. He wrote, "Nobody on their deathbed regrets the goals they didn't hit. They regret the calls they didn't make, the trips they postponed for a better time that never came, and the sentences they swallowed because saying them felt too vulnerable." He asked me, directly, to make one phone call I'd been avoiding, to an old friend I'd drifted from over a stupid, forgotten argument, before I even finished reading the rest of the letter. I made that call the next morning. My friend cried on the phone. So did I. We've spoken every week since. That's the strange power of a letter like this. It doesn't just tell you what to feel. It gives you an assignment. He wrote something that directly contradicted almost everything I'd built my adult identity around. He said he used to believe rest had to be earned, that you worked first and relaxed only once you'd proven you deserved it, and that this belief had quietly stolen decades from him because there was always more to prove. "Rest is not the reward at the end of a life well worked," he wrote. "Rest is a part of living well, right now, today, regardless of what you've accomplished. Don't wilt for permission that will never come." He told me that some of his happiest memories weren't the promotions or the milestones. They were the ordinary, unproductive Sunday mornings he almost never allowed himself, when he'd just sit with a coffee and do absolutely nothing with my mother, and how he wished he'd given himself 1,000 more mornings exactly like that. Near the end of the letter, he wrote about the times he sat in the hospital in his final months, watching people visit,
Some who talked constantly, trying to fill the silence with achievements and updates and reassurances, and some who simply sat, held his hand, and said nothing at all. He said the silent ones, the ones who just showed up and stayed,